This is Zachlog the Great, and I am here tonight with my friend Chris.
Hello.
And we are joined tonight by from the far future, from the last days of the First Galactic Empire, by psychohistorian Hari Seldon.
It's a pleasure to meet you. I am Hari Seldon. If any of you are standing, please sit. If you'd like to smoke or something, feel free. I can't see you. I'm not really there.
Is that how he introduces any in the books? Does he say that, something like that? Okay.
He specifically said that. I'm a bit more informal, but he specifically said, I want this to be an informal thing because, well, I can't see you. There's no point in formality.
Yes, so for those of you who are not classic science fiction fans, this is a character from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, which I should reread at least the first one or two sometime soon. I read them as a teenager, and although I am aware I look quite young, being a teenager is a couple decades behind me now. So, but tonight we are getting together to talk about Jim Butcher's new novel, Peace Talks. Since you are the since you're the new guy, Harry, would you care to start us off? What's your big impression, or what's the first thing you'd like to cover?
First thing I'd like to cover, I think, is probably the most obvious thing. This is not an entire book. It is very clear that, and we know this from Jim Butcher's blog, so this is not a surprise, but it's very clear in the book that this was originally one book that's been split up into two. And I think it did lose something in that process. My suspicion that I can't confirm is that Jim Butcher saw how good Infinity War was as its own standalone, as separate from Endgame. And what I think he missed was that though Infinity War and Endgame were written to be a cohesive story, they were still written separately as separate books. As separate movies. So I think when he tried to take one book and turn it into two so he could get the same effect, it lost something in the process.
So, okay. I actually don't usually follow his blog, so either of you may be better informed than me on this one. I was under the impression that it wasn't that he had actually planned this. So, okay, Battlegrounds is coming out in
September.
In September. So that's much closer than his usual release schedule. I'd been under the impression that he had actually been planning this as one book, and then his editors looked at it and looked at how big this was getting and said, no, this is way too much. You got to split this.
Yes, but I suspect he could have disagreed, given how much money he's likely made his editors through this series of books. I suspect if he'd really cared, he could have disagreed, but he decided, no, I think it'll work.
So, oh yes, and so side note, if things work out, we are hoping to get the same group back together to cover that book shortly after its release. So if you like this, tune back in about 2 months, and hopefully we should be covering that as well. Chris, how about you? What was the first thing you wanted to talk about this one?
Well, the thing that struck me is, like, a lot of these novels will start off with like something big where you realize there's a problem, like, hey, you have a kid, she's been kidnapped by vampires, or hey, you're a ghost, if you don't want to stay a ghost forever, you got stuff to do. Whereas this, it started off where it was just small things that just kept adding up, where instead of starting with like one big problem, we're just going to accumulate a lot of different complications that are all sort of acting against each other, and then just watch things get more and more out of control. So even though Harry is like addressing problems, you also know there is so much stuff going on that he is just not even capable of paying attention to.
I'd say the closest... Oh, go for it.
Well, I was going to say that is how, like, at least the first half of the novel goes. But I will say there is one hint early on that there's something else going on, which then most of us probably forget until the entrance of Ethnu. I'm probably saying that wrong. Because after their jog on the beach, Harry looks down and realizes he's standing in an enormous footprint. And it seems like that, what is Chekhov's gun? It seems like that's probably Ethnu's. And so, like, there's all this other stuff going on, but he does drop that flag there. So when it gets to that point, you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's like, again, like, though he just found out that his brother's girlfriend is pregnant with vampire baby. So he has other things occupying his mind. And then shortly after he finds out, hey, the peace talks are going to happen. You're on the security detail. And, the people you're working for are thinking about, just kicking you out. And like things just rapidly pile up.
Well, and then
so one of the things that I like about the Dresden Files novels is Jim Butcher is not afraid to put Harry through hell.
Yes.
Like he can be completely abusive to him, so that when Harry comes on top at the end, you feel like he's really earned it. But in most cases, it's like, hey, here's some, insurmountable odds that you're just going to have to like push your way through. But this, again, it's just the sheer number of things that he has to deal with. He just can't address everything. There's just not enough time for him to do it. So he just has to start picking and choosing his priorities. And I just think that's a really interesting take on it that I don't think he's really done in any of the others.
I think he did it to an extent in Changes. Obviously, the exact structure was different, but you still had these constant problems. His apartment getting destroyed would have been the climax of a previous book. But here it was just one more problem that he had to solve. Same with the Blue Beetle getting killed off for real. And same with quite a number of other things that were happening in the book before the climax. I think that's the only other time he's done something like this. And I think the book's better off for it. Changes was excellent.
Well, the other thing I was just going to say, I spend probably more time than I should browsing through TV tropes, and so the kind of character who is just constantly abused. They have the chew toy as the name for that trope, and I think that pretty adequately describes Harry Dresden. Like, I mean, suffers pretty constant abuse from almost every source. Like, and what is it in the second novel, Full Moon, he has his friend and sometimes sometimes sort of employer punch him in the head and try to arrest him. And so it's like everything to some extent is out to get Harry Dresden, and that's just kind of how his life goes.
And if the universe ever does let up, he'll start beating himself up for something, because True Sight makes it so that you never forget. You see what you saw in perfect memory for the rest of your life. That's not great for Harry Dresden's psychology, I suspect.
Well, yeah, and we saw a little bit of that with which one was that in? turncoat. When he used that to look at the Nagloshi, and it took him a couple of hours just to, sufficiently adjust to this to become, basically mobile again, able
Mm-hmm.
to walk under his own power.
And even in,
Um,
even in different books afterwards, whenever he thinks about the Nagloshi, he has this mental stutter because it still happens. The memory just never goes away. So for Dresden, there is no escape.
And I think we kind of get a little bit of a look into the future in this one with Ebenezer, because before he was always like there was an air of mystery about him. But in this, we get to see a lot more what the sort of like wizard life and cloak and shadows things will do to you after a certain amount of time.
I feel like I don't know where this was. I feel like in one of the books he actually, when Harry was talking to another wizard, he saw this, like, this brief stuck point with them, and he's like, oh, that's something they saw the same way, and like they have that, like, same kind of reaction. I can't think of what.
It was it was at the outer gate. He was talking to the gatekeeper, um, having gotten there through the winter mother, the summer mother, no summer, not mother, crone, the
Yeah, I
eldest of the
forget
summer
the.
queens.
Yeah, I forget I forget her title, but yes.
Yes. Um, he was talking to the gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper was mentioning that the outsiders, in some cases, they're really, really bad. They're not something you want to even see.
So, what was So there's two kind of themes I saw in this book to, to resurrect your, high school literary terms. Um, but one of them more explicitly stated than the other. Which the explicitly stated one, because he even says it. I think Harry pretty much says it at some point when they're going into Marconi. What is it? The Better Future Society.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that one would be, security. Safety is also a prison. Um, and
Oh, I didn't
there's
catch that.
okay. So there's three main times I think he touches on this idea. And I think Harry does effectively say this, when they're going in, because I don't know if he's aware at that point that he's gonna have to break Thomas out. But when he's getting into the apartments, the Svartalv's apartments, where and he looks at all the security measures, and he's like, yeah, it's a real pain to get in, but at the same time, like, it is protection. Um, and then when he goes into the Better Future Society, and I didn't note that moment. I don't think. Let me see. Oh, nope. Oh. Yeah, I didn't note that. I don't think I noted that moment, but he said. I think he pretty much said that, going into the Better
Nothing was
Future
getting
Society.
in now. The castle would make one hell of a defensive position. Or, some nasty, suspicious part of me said, nothing was getting out, making it one hell of a trap.
Right. Okay. And then the third time, where he doesn't actually say this, but it's like echoing the other two, is when he's putting Thomas in his cell. I don't know what you call that. But when he's locking Thomas away for his own good, um, and in that case it's the other way, because he's using what is usually supposed to be a prison as protection, and so and it's the it's the same thing people have been arguing about in different shades since in the United States since like September 2001. Security and freedom, and it's like the more you have of one, the less you tend to have of the other. Although I will say that also that actually seems a little incomplete to me, because I think there's a third point that makes that a triangle, and you kind of have to pick two, because I think to have it complete, it would be security, freedom, and wealth. Pick two. You can have security and wealth, but probably not that much freedom. Security and freedom, not that much wealth, or wealth and security. Anyway, you know what I'm saying.
Well, so I think another sort of example, or at least pointing to that idea, is Harry's relationship to the White Council, because he does sort of like chafe at the leadership, and he knows that there's something not too great going on there, but he also absolutely needs their protection, because so many things that want to kill him only refrain from doing so because he's part of it.
I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, that actually fits as well, and that's relevant to the story here, because now for the first time, it seems like that protection may be withdrawn, and he has to consider what it's going to look like going without that.
Yeah, and I think he even kind of refers to Ebenezer as previously like having been his warden.
Yeah, well, Ebenezer, well, before he knew that Ebenezer was also his grandfather, Ebenezer was the guy who, volunteered to take responsibility for reforming this young warlock, or potential warlock. So how about any other big overarching kind of themes in here from either of you?
So I think even a few different characters said it, but like, don't borrow troubles. Which again, like, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's only so much you can focus on.
Yeah, that is definitely, especially when you get to the end, when you get to the events of the last. I didn't read this as a physical copy. I read this as an ebook, so I don't actually have page numbers. I would guess the last 100 pages are where things get really strange. Yeah. And so like, yeah, don't borrow troubles, because there's enough coming your way without going out to look for them. The other kind of big theme I saw here, which isn't stated, but I just saw this coming up several times, is kind of disability and old wounds. And like, because there's, let's see, the first thing you see of this would be Ramirez when he comes to tell Harry about the peace talks, and if you've read, you have to have read, what is it, Briefcases? Wait, which one was it? Side Jobs was the earlier one, yeah. And so
yeah, I believe it's Briefcases.
If you've read Briefcases, you know where this one came from. But Ramirez is badly injured, and has to walk with a cane and kind of hobbling, and and he's understandably rather upset about how all that went down. And before, he was this energetic, vivacious, I guess would be a good word for it, young man. And so seeing that is quite a change. And then other cases, there's Karen Murphy, trying to recover from her injuries, Um, there's and there's and
I would
then
argue, I don't know how much chronological order we go in, but I would argue Mab actually fits that quite well. But it's not going to make sense until we discuss that scene.
right.
But with
Well,
what you're going with, there's also like Michael is there who he's recovered, but he's also retired. And then also one character, I think it might be Laura, even points out that Harry still has the burned hand.
yeah. Well, and also then it turns out not to be a thing, but it briefly looks as if Sonya is going to be, one-handed for a while. Um, and what was the other? Oh, and then the Svartalfs, to imprison Thomas, they didn't bother building a some kind of super strong cage or anything to put him in. They just relentlessly beat him until he would not have any kind of capacity, to even attempt an escape. Which, I mean, when you're dealing with a white court vampire, that actually sounds like a, probably a good plan. Just if you are, entirely ruthless. So.
So kind of with the old wounds thing, if we broaden it out a little bit, like I really enjoyed just how present the past was in this book, because like you see like Faravax and like characters that you haven't seen for a long time.
Right.
There are
Faravax, we haven't
references.
seen since Bianca's party in Blood Rights, I think.
I believe so.
No, it was a grave peril.
Great Peril, that's right,
Okay.
that's right.
Which actually, if I understand correctly, Jim Butcher said like that he actually kind of planted a lot of seeds in that book and at that party specifically that wouldn't come up until much later in the series. So
I think we're seeing one, yeah.
yeah, and so I went back probably a year ago now, and I reread that one, and then I looked at him like, wow, yeah, I am seeing quite a few hints here of things that the significance didn't strike me at the time, including at one point when they're bargaining for their safety or escape with I guess it would be Leah, because we hadn't met Mab yet. They were bargaining with Leah for their safety, and one of the things she asks for is Michael's daughter Molly, and then I'm like, oh,
Huh.
well, ended up getting her.
Yeah, but yeah, and then so we also see Bigfoot, River Shoulders from the short stories. There's a mention of the famous donut, and I think my favorite is their cloaking spell being the same spell from Full Moon, which is like the second book.
Mm-hmm.
Potion, not spell.
Yeah, right, potion. Yeah.
But same effect.
Right, which is kind of similar because in Changes, the big spell that the vampires are trying to pull off, I believe that's the same one from the very first book that kicked everything off.
Yes,
yeah,
that
except
was
on a massively larger scale.
Yeah, like in the first book, the guy just didn't have the sheer power to make it go as far as it could. But that's one of the things that I really like about the series as a whole, but how much like it was pushed in this book is just taking the series as like a cohesive whole. Because something like Harry Potter, inside the books, they're consistent, but over the course of the series, they don't really pay attention to it that much, which like the stuff people get into with like the Time Turner and all that. But in the Dresden Files, like things make sense over much longer periods of time. He seems to pay a lot more attention to how everything meshes together.
A sad
One,
example of that is actually Gwyn ap Nudd, um, his head being thrown into the group. If you haven't read that story, it turns out that he was responsible for the Billy Goat curse, which led to the Cubs not winning a World Series. At the time that the book was written, I believe the Cubs had still not won a World Series. But obviously now they have, and now we see why. It's because he was killed between that book and now.
Yeah, so it's even consistent with the real world. That kind of makes me worry about Chicago now.
We'll keep an eye out. Yeah.
Uh,
Regarding you mentioned Carlos and how it's dealing with the past. How the wounds that he's dealing with. I also found it interesting that his suspicion of Harry has been going on since the showdown uh, at the White Vampire Court with the ghouls, where he knew Harry well enough to know that Harry can only barely speak Latin, and now is suddenly fluent in ancient Etruscan, can understand and speak to ghouls. It was mentioned that Carlos was getting suspicious. So now, when he was injured by Molly, who he knows was not like this before becoming the Winter Lady. He knows that Lloyd Slate was not a monster before becoming the Winter Knight. Now, somebody who he likes, but he was already suspicious of, has taken the mantle of the Winter Knight. He's going to have a hard time trusting him.
well, yeah, and the other thing, one other thing with that, um, and I don't know if Ramirez would have any idea why it happened, which that also changes things. But you know, Molly was the one who put him into his current state,
Mm-hmm.
and did so in a rather humiliating fashion. Um, and so also Molly is a good friend of Harry's, a much closer friend than Ramirez, and so that would be another reason why he's probably a little more a little more touchy with Harry than he used to be, because like, well, what did
Harry's
you?
boss crippled him almost.
Yeah, and like the thing is, the other thing is we know why that happened, but we have no idea if he knows.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what would be the? I'm trying to think. I guess it's dramatic irony, but it's not complete. It's not entirely dramatic irony because we don't know whether or not he does know that. Um, but yeah, what was
well, and even apart from them being responsible for his condition, it's just now his entire worldview has to be different, because before he was capable and cocky. Now he's been humbled, and he's also not at 100% anymore. So just in general, he has to take any threat a little bit more seriously, just because now he knows he can't handle everything and he's not at the top of his game.
So what was so I had one more kind of big idea note here, and this isn't so much from this book in particular as it is with the series as a whole. Okay, so there's the three swords. There's, what is it? Phaedalachius, Esperachius, and Amarachius, which is roughly faith, hope, and love. Which are the three theological virtues. And one thing I noted, I was thinking about this, and I realized that like there's the White Court of Vampires. We've almost only seen one group of them, which is the House Wraith. But but apparently there's also House Malvora and House Scavis. House Wraith are basically succubuses, feeding on sexual energy, and they are, their one great weakness is genuine love. And it occurred to me that there's also Malvora and Scavis. Scavis feeds on despair. Malvora feeds on fear. And it kind of seems like the three swords match those, because the opposite of despair would be hope, right? And then it's not perfect, but I think you could put faith as an opposite to fear. And so I'm kind of I kind of wonder whether there's anything to that, whether I'm just I'm just seeing things that aren't there.
Hard to say, because I could also see faith being the opposite of despair and hope being the opposite of fear. I'm not quite sure if there's a one-to-one correspondence with that. Obviously, with Lara's court, obviously love is unambiguous, but the other two I'm not positive.
Well, and I will say one more point that counts against my theory. When I was looking up stuff about this, apparently, in some of the role-playing game materials, there are hints that there is a fourth House Wraith who uses anger, and so like that would obviously, if there was a fourth house, fourth house of a white court, and if there was a fourth one, then this whole thing just breaks down. It occurs to me that if there were a fourth one, they would obviously be running cable news if they feed on anger.
Yeah, or be moderators for online comment sections on news articles. They would have a lot of business, actually, in the same way that the White Court is doing, House Wraith is doing great these days. This other house is probably doing pretty well.
I will say it was kind of interesting. Which one was that? Blood Rights, where, the one where Harry goes to work on a porn set. And it was, kind of interesting where he said, oh yeah, the House Wraith has a lot of connections here. And, someone said, I wonder if they're basically using this as a, what is it? To kind of, shape what we should like so that they can more easily make use of us. And it's, an interesting sideways critique of pornography.
Yeah, I can see that.
So I have like several notes on like particular points. I've covered all the big ideas though that I wanted to. So were there any other overarching things in this one you guys wanted to cover?
I'll say that throughout the book, there is a much higher focus on sex than there normally is. The only one I can really compare it to was Small Favor. And there you had, the whole plot was revolving around the White Court. Now, I got the sense that everybody is the White Court.
That was another point I was thinking about. Just if you're reading something written in the 21st century, you kind of expect some of this. It's kind of seems like it's impossible to avoid. But it seems like there is a higher note, a higher presence of to use outmoded language, sexual depravity in this one, and it a little bit got on my nerves.
Go ahead. Oh yeah. So I can see that, but also it's it's not really framed as a way to make you think it's good. He's like actively trying to resist what he recognizes as, bad urges. And he's trying to keep it under control. And then he's also dealing with, with Laura a lot. So those themes are going to be there, but he's actively trying to keep his feelings under control and not let those emotions get the better of him.
I would agree with you in part. There are parts where, even though it's not stated, you could reasonably assume that this is the winter mantle affecting him, just like we've seen him get a lot angrier because of the winter mantle. Where I think that fails is Butters. Because I can't... We've seen before that power has a cost. So Thomas, for instance, is irresistible to women, but we've seen the downsides. We see, what the consequences of that are. We've seen Harry's previous relationships have all resulted in or been caused by death. So, Lucio and Harry, as a result, Harry missed the mind control that Peabody was doing. Susan and Harry led to Susan's death. Mab and Harry required Harry to murder a guy. Elaine and Harry ended up with Harry killing their mentor, which granted might have been for the best, but still, like this, it has serious consequences. Even if it works out, it's not something that in previous books they treated casually. And that was the distinction I thought I saw here.
Well, okay, there's Butters, and the other point, okay, you have Laura Wraith, in this.
Sure,
book,
but that's...
You're going to have that.
Mm-hmm.
But the other point that stuck out to me, where, like I said, it's a little irritating, was the bisexual Valkyrie, and it's like, this is kind of unnecessary. I don't remember her name off the top of my head, but it just...
So even though she wasn't White Court, like that, I just sort of went with, okay, who's going to want this job? I feel like working for
not
that
going to be
employer,
a normal person,
right? But yes, the Butters thing did take me by surprise. I think I actually had to reread it to make that section to make sure I interpreted that right, and I'm like, okay.
Well, I will say one other interesting thing, which if it turns out, if this comes out in later books, I will withdraw my criticism. If, like we see later down the line, like there's some kind of consequences, and it's like that was a mistake. Like I will withdraw that. Which, the way the series has worked out so far, that actually seems quite plausible to me.
I'll say the same.
Yeah, but, and I think it does show some character development for Butters, because he's like, most of his life he was sort of the nerdy loser, and this is kind of the first point where he's like actually like cool. Like, he's doing good things. Like, he's been doing it for a little while now, but also, like, when he first started off after, Harry was a ghost, like, it would have been new to him. Whereas now it seems like he's settled down, where now he knows what he's capable of. He knows he's a guy that does cool things. And it could be that confidence is just sort of, he's just getting a little cocky with it.
So he's to borrow terminology from Vox Day. He's been recategorized as an alpha, and along with the benefits of that, he also has some of the characteristic weaknesses.
Even with him getting overconfident. And almost, cutting off his friend's hand.
So one other thing, now that you just mentioned that, okay, so that they had this whole conversation after that about what was really going on here. And one thing that occurred to me, they're like, well, it looks like it can't cut ordinary people. Like it can only do damage to supernatural monsters. And I was reading this, and I'm like, you don't have enough data to say that yet. It could be that it will be perfectly happy to cut mortals whom, by whatever standard it applies, it deems evil or, wicked. And so, go ahead.
I'm not sure that would be consistent with how the Knights of the Cross have been portrayed previously. And I'm thinking specifically about Nicodemus. Remember when Karen tried to kill Nicodemus with the Sword of Faith when Nicodemus was mortal, when he had taken off the coin? Nicodemus was obviously 100% evil as a mortal, but the sword still deactivated, for lack of a better word, when she tried to do it.
Well, but the other thing with that was it wasn't about him. It was about her and her motivation. Like
that's true.
She wasn't doing this, in righteousness, in because she was pursuing the right. She was doing this because she was furious. She was rightly furious, but it was kind of it's kind of like in I guess it has to be Exodus or Numbers, but where the second time they needed water, God told Moses to speak to the stone, and Moses struck the stone, and God's like, and God said, okay, you didn't obey me, and you did that basically because you wanted it to look like you who was doing this. And I'm afraid now you're not going to be able to go into the promised land. It was like, kind of trying to seize the glory, seize the power for his own. And, kind of like what that seems a little bit like what Murphy was doing there.
That's, if that's the case, then I wonder what would happen if it distinguishes between good mortals and evil mortals. I wonder what would happen if you tried to kill one of the bearers of the coins, or the nickelheads, as Harry calls them. Because in theory, if you have a genuinely unwilling host, then you might have the sword go right through the human body and kill or hurt the fallen angel possessing him.
Well, and I hadn't thought about this before, but like in their previous versions, the swords and the other two, the swords and the coins basically have no interaction. Like the sword, you have a sword, you have a coin, they're not going to do anything to each other. This one could actually like go right through the coin. This one could potentially destroy the coin itself. And so that's interesting possibilities as well.
And it's also within the story, like this hasn't happened before, so they're really not sure how it's going to work. I mean, the other swords could still hurt mortals, but even if it doesn't have the supernatural power, it's still a sharpened piece of metal.
Okay, so let me see. So, the benefit of having an advanced copy, which I did, I got to read this twice before this talk, and so I got to see some things the second time that I didn't notice the first time. One of them was when he's going. This is like in the maybe second or third chapter. Harry and Thomas are going back to Harry's apartment, and Austri, the security guard there, is giving them the runaround with like okay, password, this, that, and Harry says to him, just once, would it kill you to let security protocol slide?
And he says, potentially.
Well, And then we don't know what happened at that point. We don't know the exact details, but Thomas did break in, attempt to kill the king, whose name I can't recall right now, and did kill Austri. And it's like, oh. So when I got to that the second time, I was like, oh, God, that punches now.
Yeah, that was seeing somebody who is an absolute stickler for something like that get killed potentially because he wasn't paranoid enough. That's just brutal.
So let's see. What are the other things? Other things. Let's see. I'm just going through a list of notes right now, by the way. So if you guys have a similar list and want to jump in at any point, feel free. Again, this is in chapter 1. And this is Harry talking to Thomas. But you can't ignore things that are real just because they're uncomfortable. And I read that and I'm like, well, that describes so much about our world today.
I hate to say it, but I'm not sure Harry's one to talk there. Although to be fair, that he's recognized this about himself at least. But yeah, I'd agree with you on that. I found his early conversation with Thomas interesting, and I wonder what I can't help but think that something is up with Justine. Obviously, she's pregnant. Obviously, that this is a very unusual event to start with. But I'm wondering if there might be something more than that. Because there was a quote from Small Favor that I found. Harry was, dealing with the mind control. He wasn't able to, speak while conscious, but they'd heard him while unconscious say Molly, and they knew from that they should trust her. And it specifically mentioned that you should listen to the first words out of your mouth when you woke up. That if something had messed with your mind, your subconscious might be able to communicate that way while you were on the edge of sleep.
Yeah, he was waking up and they were talking about him, I think. And I think the first thing he said was listen to her, she knows what she's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. Okay, and so Justine, go ahead.
Yeah. In fact, the only thing we've heard from Thomas after, the quote imprisonment that the Svartalfs did, the only thing we've heard was a word that we're assuming to be Justine, and that's all he said. And he's clearly in that same kind of mental state, where he's only a fragment of his mind is there right now. But I'm wondering, he knows that Harry is going to protect Justine. He knows that Harry is going to try to keep her safe and to keep the baby safe. Is there something more to it? Because it's not in character for Thomas to just try to assassinate the king of the Svartalfs for no reason. My guess, and I don't know, I'll have to wait to read Battlegrounds. My guess is that something's going on with Justine. Worst case scenario, she's been infected with Nemesis, which is A, how she's able to break vampire nature and have a baby, but also B, why she was able to get Thomas to attempt the assassination, if that's what happened.
So the only other thing that I can think of as far as Thomas goes is, and this is me trying to remember way back to one of the short stories, but he's a part of a secret organization that's trying to actively make people forget about the more dangerous of the supernatural entities.
The Oblivion War. For those of you who haven't read that story, Ivy, the archive, is a perfect collection of all written knowledge in the world, past or future, past or present. And Ivy, as a result, is leading a group called leading a group fighting what's known as the Oblivion War. Certain entities can be summoned, and even knowing about them gives them power. And so they're fighting to remove traces of these entities from the world.
One thing, it's even what is it? It's human mortals knowing about them gives them power. And so who is it who recruits Thomas in that story?
Is he recruited in that story, or was he
I don't think so.
No, well,
was
no,
he already working?
Someone gets him involved in that. I want to say, and this sounds weird, but I want to say it's Bob the Skull.
I don't remember, but I was just thinking, okay, so this is something that is big, that he knows how important it is, that Harry has no idea. So if he were to act as part of that, the consequences could be world ending. So it makes sense that he would be willing to act. And also Harry would have no way to explain it.
That is a possibility.
Well, okay, then the second consequence of that would mean that it would be bringing, because previously the Oblivion Wars were only mentioned in that story, and so that would be, kind of bringing them into the novels themselves.
Like with Bigfoot and the Irish name, which I'm not going to try to pronounce. I guess I'll try. Yes, Gwynapnud.
Now I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right either. I may be butchering it.
So and it's what was so that that would fit in, and that also would there, I think there's kind of a sense in starting in this book that the series as a whole is like it's approaching a big climax. Does that sound right to you guys?
Well, it looks like whatever's going to happen, the masquerade is over. It's going to be hard to actually cover things up if anything really big goes down in Chicago, and that's the way things are headed.
So far, I'm not convinced of that. You could potentially spin this as what we've had here so far is an EMP. That means that no security cameras, no cell phone footage is going to be recorded of what's going on. You could maybe try to salvage it as some kind of freak chemical attack or something that causes wide-scale hallucinations and psychosis. Maybe. It'd be hard, but so far you can still do it.
Yeah, it kind of depends on, how, as far as we can guess, how the next book plays out. But yeah, you could, I hadn't considered that because there will be no electronic, recording of any of this, which these days, everything is electronic.
Pixar, it didn't happen.
Right, and so, it seems like, okay, with what has happened in this book, you could say, EMP. And that could, be a sufficient, look, we've all got to stay sane and pretend this stuff isn't going on explanation. But what
Even
else?
if they do manage to cover it up, though, if they try, every time something pokes at the masquerade again, it's going to be a much harder to cover up because people are going to be connecting the dots and saying, oh, well, I wonder if this is like those conspiracy theories I read about Chicago. Because people are going to be talking about this. The stuff that goes down in the next book, people are going to try to get the word out.
Yeah, you already have the Paranet organizing.
Mm-hmm.
So Alex Jones would be the place to turn to find out what's going on, is what you're saying.
Alex Jones and that black and white newspaper that used to be sold in stores, talking about how Hitler was reborn with two heads.
World
News Daily.
World News Daily, yes. There was
Yes, I believe right now it's Bat Boy 2020 and Spy Cat invading Russia.
I need to renew my
Oh,
subscription. Clearly.
so there was a what's the book? Oh no, I was listening to a YouTube video a month or so back, and he was kind of like reviewing the Dresden series as a whole and trying to give someone who hasn't read these an idea whether or not this would be for them. And one thing he said I found interesting, and it's definitely picking up quite a bit more here. He said this is the sneakiest epic fantasy series I've ever read, because you start at Stormfront. And no, it's not anything like that. There's nothing world shaking. It's this guy who's basically a private eye in Chicago and also can do magic. And then gradually, slowly, bit by bit, it's a frog being boiled kind of thing. It starts to accumulate more and more things and bigger and bigger ideas. And then there's a cosmic war going on. That we're seeing one of the battlefields by cold days. So I liked that description quite a bit.
Yeah, and it's really a genius way to do it, because each novel introduces a little bit more of the supernatural world, where if you get all of that right off the bat, then it's going to be a lot more confusing. It's going to be a lot shallower. And it's just not going to work as well. But if you start off with mostly mundane, little bit of supernatural, and you slowly work it up from there, not only do you have a better grasp of everything that's going on, you're learning along with some of the characters, but also it makes sense. Oh yeah, these, normal humans that are palling around with Harry, yeah, it makes sense for them to be there because they were there with him whenever things were, a lot more mundane.
I don't know if you guys ever saw the 2014 Godzilla movie.
I have not.
Not I.
I found it did things differently than a lot of other Godzilla movies in the past. Partially was just more special effects budget, but part of it was, for most of the film, they never showed Godzilla in full. You would only see draped in shadows in the background, or you would see a giant foot just obscure the light. But it wasn't until the climax of the movie that you actually see a full shot of him in one frame. A lot of the previous Godzilla movies, obviously due to special effects, it really is a guy in a rubber suit with person-sized buildings that he's knocking over. But more importantly, no matter what kind of camera angles they do, it feels like it's a guy in a rubber suit because they try to show him right away. And so you don't get a sense of scale. Here, you're following these people on the ground for almost all the movie. And then when you see the full size of what's going on, it hits you hard.
Yeah.
Well, it's go ahead, Chris.
On the flip side of that, you have the King Kong remake where it's get to the effing monkey.
I have not seen the King Kong remake. That's a fair criticism if that's true.
Have you heard the song, by the way? There's I can't remember the name of the band, but there's they did this song. It's I want to say they're Australian or New Zealand, and by not distinguishing those, I've probably offended anyone from that area. But they have it's a comedy music group, and they have a song that's "Get to the Blanking Monkey," and throughout the song they suggest various ways different movies could get to the monkey. Let's see. What am I? Oh, one thing that's not in my notes, but another big idea, kind of from the book. And the way, from how I've seen this series go so far, I'm pretty sure this is not going to be for another at least one, maybe two. It's not going to be in Battlegrounds, and it might not even be in the next one. It might be the third book out from us right now. But one thing that occurred to me when he was like entombing Thomas, putting Thomas in stasis. There's a good word. When he was putting Thomas in stasis, to get Thomas back, they're gonna have to kill someone.
Because the stasis isn't going to cure his hunger?
Right. It's just keeping him pretty much where he is now, in the state he is now. And the state he is now, he's on the edge of death. And as far as we know, there's only one way a white vampire comes back from that.
Well, Laura was able to feed him a little bit from her own sort of supply. And she has a lot of people under her. It is conceivable that they could all give a little bit, but that is definitely a problem they need to figure out. But apparently, he's so far gone, they're not even sure if it's possible to bring him back.
Well, and I will say now, there is a potential solution for that which doesn't involve someone dying, which we saw in. Bigfoot on Campus.
Right. Certain entities can survive being fed on, even to an extreme degree.
I get the impression I get the impression it would have to be a half mortal. That's like my sketching together the rules from the information we're getting, but yeah, if you can find a half-mortal with sufficient life who's willing to volunteer for the job, I think they might get survive. But yeah, like when they were putting him in, I'm like, to get him back, someone's gonna die. Who is that?
Well, it's sort of the like mainstay of the series where Harry accomplishes his goal, but just barely and at great cost. And of course, everyone watching thinks he's just that badass.
So let's see. One of my other notes. When Harry gets to his his new digs, which are now his former digs, most likely. And he says, the new apartment reminded me of my old place in the basement of Mrs. Spunklecreef's boarding house. Only there was no musty, moldy smell of old basement. And it was bigger, and it was more brightly lit, and newer, and quite a bit cleaner, and it just didn't feel right. As dumpy as it had been, that grotty little apartment had been my home. And I read that, and I was reading that, like, the first thing that sprung to mind is a poem I did a couple months back, which was actually an excerpt by Sir Walter Scott, which is, breathes there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself hath said, this is my own, my native land. And, like, having that place where even if it's run down and kind of awful, it's like, no, this is mine. I definitely, I understand how he feels there.
And he doesn't seem to have anything like that now in terms of a physical place or a physical thing. The Blue Beetle, his old apartment, his original staff, everything that he had material connections to was destroyed one way or another in changes. Right now he has an apartment that he lives at, and it's safe, and it's something he thinks is good to raise Maggie in, but it's not. It doesn't feel like home, as he's saying. And then Demon Reach, it's a place that he works at effectively. He lived there for a while because he had to, and he could make it work, but it wasn't home.
Well, and the fact that the closest thing to a home he currently has is Demon Reach is just so troubling in and of itself, which he starts to realize at the end. But again, there's too much going on. He just has to file that away for later.
So the next one, when when the Svartalfs are showing Harry, are explaining to Harry what happened, and they're showing him his brother. Ivana walks up to the cage, says Thomas Wraith, "You will die for this, or there will be a war such as this world has not seen in a millennium." And I'm like, well, she's right, but not how she thinks.
I need to reread because I missed that on the first reading.
Yeah, I will say, I think this one has rather more rewarded rereads than most of the Harry Dresden books previously, which is not to say they're not worth it, but like there are several things where you go through the second time and you're like, wow, hello, that means something different now.
Mm-hmm. I will note, just as I don't know where else to fit this in, Conjuritis. The fact that it was introduced out of nowhere, it feels like a plot contrivance unless it's very clever foreshadowing. Because the fact that it comes out of nowhere, that it messes things up but then solves a problem for him, it feels weird. But everybody who talked to Harry about it said, "Oh, I thought that was only a disease kids got." What I'm wondering is did he get it from Maggie? Is Maggie's starting to have magical talent that maybe she and Harry don't know about yet?
So that thought had kind of occurred to me, but I wrote it off pretty quickly because she didn't seem to be showing any symptoms. But then again, I guess a magical disease doesn't really have to follow, physical disease rules.
Well, even if it does have to follow it, asymptomatic transmission is certainly a thing.
Oh God, no! Please, no! Let's not go there. I don't. Shortly after Harry and Ebenezer confront, or shortly after Harry goes to visit Justine, him and Ebenezer get attacked by corner hounds. Now, I'm pretty sure Chris doesn't know this. Harry, do you know where this is from?
I do not.
Okay. This is these things are called the Hounds of Tyndalos. And it was actually they refer to Lovecraft a little later talking about this, but it actually wasn't by Lovecraft, although
it was Frank Belknap Long.
Right, yeah. And so that's not a bad story, by the way. I would definitely suggest looking it up. It's like 10 or 15 pages. But yeah, so this is but in that one you never actually see the creatures. Basically the person who was poking at things that man is better knowledge, what's the phrase? Things man was not meant to know. He ends up dead, and like all about what actually happened to him is kind of his last writings as he realizes what's about to happen to him. Oh yes, and also the fun thing there, Harry asks, so what happens if they catch you? And Ebenezer says a phrase wizards are never supposed to say.
I don't
know.
I love the line comparing that to dropping the F-bomb for wizards, that this would effectively be an obscenity. I loved that.
Yeah.
I will say I found it odd that they didn't make a bigger deal of that. I don't think Harry mentioned that to Carlos, even though in theory they were on the same security team, that, oh yeah, we might have outsiders involved in this.
But there was also speculation that this could be involved with the whole Black Council. So
that's true.
they're trying to keep that group small.
That's true, but I think Harry's been assuming thus far that Carlos is not on the Black Council because he's talked to him about the Black Council before. I find it interesting that Harry didn't try to tell him, even as an aside, if, say, he didn't trust the others on the team.
Yeah, and that's well, and the other thing, and this is kind of referring back to Chris's initial assessment of the book. The best explanation I have for that is just there's so much happening all at once.
Oh, that even he can't keep it all straight.
Yeah, and he's just like, and and the other thing is when he next talks to Ramirez after that, it's not a friendly conversation. From the very start of it, there's a definite interrogation feel to it. And so, like, Harry's not really in the mood to, give up information.
That's true.
What was the next? Let's see. The next note I have here. They're coming to the when he's driving out to the Wraith Estates. And he says, hell, given how much money and power the White Court had, I just look at that and like. These days, the first thing I think of when I see something like that, I'm like, so Jeffrey Epstein was working with them, huh?
That would explain a lot, certainly. I wouldn't be surprised if we know that the Red Court was very highly involved in a lot of Central and South American governments. Because when the Red Court was destroyed, he said that about half a dozen governments just collapsed overnight. It would not be surprising if within the Dresden Files, within the universe logic, that the White Court are as heavily involved in United States government and in Western governments.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and go ahead, Chris.
Sense. No, I was just saying that makes sense.
Well, yeah, and there were a few things from because of a few people I follow. I knew the name Jeffrey Epstein probably at least a year before a lot of to use. I don't know what better term to use for it right now. Probably about a year before most of the normies did. I followed a couple people who mentioned him, and some of the things he had been up to, because a lot of people didn't, as far as I can tell, most people didn't really know that much about who he was until his arrest, I guess, about a year ago, and I'd seen a few people talking about him at least 2 or 3 years ago. But there was some indication from things like way back when that he may have been involved with some intelligence agencies for some country, and we don't, which ones we don't really have a good idea. Which also would be probably very good business for the White Court.
Yeah. Well, and it would be so easy for them to, blackmail politicians, get them on their side, because, I mean, they can seduce like no one else. So they just send, one of their members to whatever politician, spend a night, and then they have plenty of blackmail material.
Well, and it doesn't even, you wouldn't even have to, because the problem with blackmail is there's always a risk of them, turning very hostile. And, with the White Court, they wouldn't even have to go as far as blackmail. They could just have a hugely inordinate amount of influence over, person A, B, or C.
Blackmail wouldn't hurt, though. Just as one extra cherry on top.
Let's see.
Well, and real world, sex scandals are a thing. So I guess now we know who's behind them.
It's nice to see these things from the real world make so much more sense. in the context of a gigantic supernatural fight.
Let's see. There's so one thing I kind of wondered about, and I had looked this up after, when he met the Valkyrie who's currently working for the White Court, whose name I can't remember. Well, here, is it here? Let me see if I can find the. Is her name here? Is her name here? But okay. Oh, Freydis. There it is. So they call her a Valkyrie, and I was like, Valkyries, were they actually like fighters? Were they actually in the original stories? Were they warriors, or were they more angels of death? And so I looked this up a little bit. Okay, I did a Wikipedia research, which I'm aware. I'm aware of the limitations of that, but from what I saw, they were angels of death, and there wasn't really any implication of them joining in and fighting themselves, which made a lot more sense to me, given how the old stories tended to be. They were very sexist and misogynist.
Speaking of Wikipedia research, I did some on Ethnio. And it is clear that the Dresden Files is changing a lot from the mythology, which is fine. But one thing that they might not change, in Celtic mythology, Ethnio's mother was killed by the Spear of Destiny, which is the lance that was used to pierce Christ during the crucifixion. And that was one of the two things that Harry got out of storage at the end of this book. So I'm wondering if he's going to try to kill Ethnio the same way her mother was killed back 1,000 years ago.
Did he when he put Thomas in stasis, did he use a knife of any kind as part of that? I think he had to cut him. He had to cut himself.
I don't think it was the knife, though.
No,
I think
it wasn't that one. He had Alfred go get that for him.
Yes.
So no, it wasn't that knife, but he did use a knife as part of that. Which seeing how that fight plays out, presumably in Battlegrounds, should definitely be interesting. And that is a detail I did not know. That's kind of cool.
It was I just looked, it was a pocket knife that he said he'd stuffed in his suit pants before leaving. So not even something that was particularly big, but just enough to draw blood.
So one thing I was kind of curious about, just the way people talked about her in this novel. I kind of wonder if Lara is openly leading the White Court now. Because the way things were since White Knight, was White Knight that one?
Yeah, the pretense was that the White King was still in charge.
Right, but she had gained control of him.
It seems like people are still paying that lip service, so she probably has had time to consolidate her power, where now she doesn't have to hide it as much.
Right. Yeah, because it's a lot more it seems a lot more open acknowledgement that it's her. There's not even any reference to him being at the talks.
Right, even though a lot of other
important.
heads of state, so to speak, are at the talks. That's a good catch. I think Chris is right on that. I think it went from originally a genuine cover-up to a polite fiction to perhaps now something that she doesn't even need to pretend.
Okay, so the next one I have here, and I'm seeing if I can find the source of this. Where does this come from? And it's okay. Is it in this group? Okay, but let's see. What is it? Harry is talking to River Shoulders, the Bigfoot, and Harry says, "Don't know about how much courage I have," and River Shoulders says, "Seem to have a bit. Now, courage ain't everything, but you build everything else on it. Which maybe Jim Butcher hasn't read this, but this seems to me a pretty clear reference to something else. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
No, I've seen various quotes about how courage is not the lack of fear, but the resolve to do things in spite of it. But I haven't seen that particular quote before.
It's okay, yeah, and it's not a direct quote, but the idea is so close. Chris, how about you? Do you know what I think? Okay. So what this immediately called up for me was C.S. Lewis. I knew it was C.S. Lewis, but I didn't know from where. What I'm looking at right now, which is one of those sources where you're like, is this the correct one? But what I'm looking at right now says it's from the Screwtape Letters. Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. And so, like I said, I don't know if Jim Butcher has read that, but that seems way too close to me to that idea to not be a reference.
It's a fascinating comparison either way.
Let's see, what else? No, skip that.
Well, speaking of river shoulders, he mentioned that the Genasqua might be back. And if true, that's insane. We know that Nicodemus is unkillable with his coin. That's the whole point. But the rest of the coins, their whole point is to find new hosts.
It's not the coin. It's not the coin that keeps Nicodemus unkillable. It's the noose.
Oh, that's right. That's right. So even more so in that case, the coins don't make you immortal. The coins themselves are immortal. I will say I went back and looked. There was no reference of finding the Genasqua's coin or of it rolling out of the rubble or anything. We have no idea what happened to it. But I find it hard to believe that anything could survive being squished flat like that.
That actually reminds me of one interesting thing I saw from I thought of after reading Skin Game, because there's the 30 denarius, the 30 silver coins, each infested by each corrupted by one of these demons, and then and we've seen that they are very hard to contain, and that when one of the knights manages to get one, they send it to the church, and the church has some kind of containment system, but at the very least it's leaky.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of by the end of Skin Game, at least one of them, Lashiel, the bearer, gets killed in Hades' vault. I don't think that one's getting out.
One would hope. On one hand, Hades' vault clearly has been good so far at keeping valuables contained, but on the other hand, we just saw people successfully break into it. So it's a toss-up. One hopes that it's still possible that, say, Nicodemus grabbed it on his way out.
Well, and the denarians, the denarius just in general tend to pop up like a bad penny.
Yeah, it's mentioned that it's in the fundamental nature of coins. And as a fan of Thomas Aquinas, I appreciated this sort of thing. But it's in the fundamental nature of coins to be in circulation. And so fundamentally, it's difficult to keep them in one place forever.
And like for me, it's sort of it's kind of like sin in our own lives. It's like you can like work on them, and you can like go one by one, get in control of them. But then you're gonna slip up when you're focusing on one. The other's gonna slip away.
Mm-hmm. And it's mentioned that there is another factor beyond just the innate tendencies of the coins. when Michael asks Harry at the end of that book, are you going to entrust the swords to the church? And are you going to entrust the other things, meaning the things related to Christ's crucifixion, are you going to entrust them to the church? And Harry says, between you and me, no. And Michael says, I fear you may be right. They fear that, they know that there's general corruption going on in the world, things like the Black Council. I think they fear that that is inside church hierarchy as well, which isn't an unreasonable fear given the circumstances.
Okay, not going there tonight.
Yes.
But yeah, and so I will agree that like the coins seem very slippery, and pinning one down is not and would not be an easy thing, but like it seems quite possible to me that at least one of them is locked away somewhere it's not gonna get out, and like how many other people have actually made it as far as Hades' treasure vault? It can't be a long list, and so like even if someone could go in there and physically retrieve it, that's not likely to happen anytime soon either.
And also, when they broke in, Hades was also, aware of what was going on.
That's true.
Willing to let them get where they got.
And he did not seem to be particularly fond of the Nickelheads himself. He mentioned that he has some old school afterlife in store for Nicodemus's daughter. So I would hope that you're right, Zachlog. I would hope that that particular coin, at least, is gone for good. But the fact that I would have said the same about the Janasqua. The fact that it's back, if it's true, is very worrying. Because that means that something, perhaps, has gotten into Hades' vault.
Well, let's see. At the point where the Janasqua went down, that was at the Gate of Ice.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the first or the second? Because there were three.
The first was the Gate of Fire.
Okay. And so, but
that's true. It would be easier to get to that gate than to get within the vault itself.
And so, yeah, they were on the way out when the Janasqua went down. What's his name? Because River Shoulders said his name. See if I can find that. Or do either of you know that?
Rage in his blood or something like that.
That
blood
sounds
on
about
his soul.
Right.
Blood on his soul. There you go.
Okay. So let's see. One other thing, one interesting thing that occurred to me, it's not really a plot point, but like, okay, Marcone is now a member of the Accords, of the Unseelie Accords. There's the word. And is the first regular mortal to be so. And he effectively established a nation, or established a government in doing that, relative to this body. And so one thing that it occurred to me, and it seems like Marcone would plan for this, he's, as far as we know, he's an ordinary mortal human. So who's his heir? Like who's going to take that once he's gone? I kind of don't. Go ahead.
We know it's not his daughter. We know that he specifically does not want his daughter involved with this life if she ever recovers.
Wait, no, is that his? I don't have the impression that that was his daughter.
Really? I
Chris?
thought it was.
You're talking about the girl who was in the coma.
Yes. I'll have to look. I thought it was, but it's possible that you're right.
Chris, can you throw in a third vote on this one?
I do not remember any specifics.
Okay, because I was under the impression it was I thought it was the daughter of that couple, and then like they ended up divorcing, and then what's her name ended up perversely working for Marcone later.
I'm looking it up. That does sound familiar. We only find this out through a vague sort of method, the soul gaze. So I think I misread it at the time.
But yeah, there was the innocent, but yeah, it's like it's not just his kind of criminal empire, which the way those things tend to go. Well, I don't know. I honestly don't know that much about them. I guess there are gangs that outlast the leader or the founder. But like being a member of the Unseelie Accords, that seems like a very different thing. And I don't think this is something the books are going to address, but it's kind of interesting to think about. Like, okay, who is this being passed on to after Marcone is out of the picture? But I don't think that's something the books are going to cover.
It's a fascinating question.
And yeah, I think that's all of the interesting notes. There were a couple more, but not that much worth talking about that I had. How about you guys?
I found Michael's discussion about faith a little bit off-putting. And I'll say this, I know that this is something, or I infer that this is something Jim Butcher believes because he's talked about it before. But he's talked about it before with Harry's narration. Seeing Michael talk about faith as, sure, I have faith in God, but Harry, I want you to have faith in something. The Catholic Church works for me, but you need to find something that works for you. That, it felt odd. And I say this, Jim Butcher, if for some weird reason you happen to be listening to this, don't take this to mean that Michael is a bad character. Michael's a fantastic character. That's what made this stand out. With anybody else, I don't think I would even have noticed. But it go for it, Chris.
Yeah, there's a similar thing in Serenity with Shepherd Book, his last words to Mal, where it's like just believe in something, which it's very weird when you have a character who's like they're kind of defined by their faith in a specific religion, being like, oh yeah, no, my religion's for me, but it doesn't have to be for you. That seems really at odds to that sort of character. The only way I can justify it, really, which kind of works for me, is this is not them speaking generally. This is speaking to a specific individual that they know very well.
Yeah, I definitely see what you're talking about with that, Harry, and I think the best justification or the best way to make that fit the character is partly that this seems like part of a conversation that he and Harry have been having for years, and that to some extent he trusts Harry's instincts, kind of, but it is a little bit jarring. Yeah.
Chris, I'll agree with you entirely on that general principle. I'll disagree a little about Shepherd Book because we got hints throughout the series that he was something else, that being a shepherd was there was more that he was involved in.
Yeah, I
so
totally get that. It's just something that like particularly stood out to me.
yeah, I'll agree with that.
There was actually, and total tangent, which we never do in these. There's it's in one of the there's a series of comics published about Serenity, apparently going from 2004. There's an ongoing one, and there's one of them actually in which you do see, and I don't know which one it is, which you do see a little bit of how Shepard got to where he is.
Yes. As he stares into his soup, he thinks about everything that got him to that point, or something like that.
And he was he? I can't remember. Like, was he? I think he was an operative. He was maybe an operative himself or something, or he was a high-ranking. He was a high-ranking soldier, like for the. What's the name of the central government?
But yeah, he infiltrated it, got himself into a position of leadership, then intentionally made a bad call in order to hinder their efforts.
And then he left, and I think even though like ideologically he still was he was happy with his choices, like I think he had a lot of guilt about like the individuals he ended up getting killed in that. And kind of running from all this, he decided to become a shepherd. So yeah, okay. But that's Firefly, which is not what we're covering tonight.
Good show though.
Yes. It's Anyway, I think I've covered most of the things I wanted to say about this book. Chris, how about you? Were there any big thoughts we hadn't gotten to yet?
Not in particular. There was just so many interesting moments, but I don't really have anything to like add to them.
Okay. Harry.
I have a few just small moments. I loved the running gag with the staring match between Odin and Farovax. That just throughout the entire peace talks, they just keep doing that. And I thought it wasn't stated, but it was stated that Odin was Beowulf.
Yes.
What I wonder was Farovax Grendel? Or are they holding a grudge from way back when?
Yeah, I think the Genoska or whatever was the like Grendelkin. Like
good point.
That's one of the sort of paths of that the Bigfoots can take.
Yeah, because
no, you're right.
Einherjar were very touchy around
around river shoulders.
Yeah. But
now go ahead, Chris.
Now we do see an interaction. It's not with Odin, but he's involved taking down a dragon in like Wagner's Ring Cycle.
Well, and also the Beowulf story, there's the part everyone's more familiar with is the fight with Grendel, and then his mother, which is kind of like from our storytelling today. That's a weird way of that's weird progression for that story. But it ends with Beowulf, fighting the dragon, and I think it would be a Pyrrhic victory would be a good term for it, because he manages to kill the dragon, but he himself dies shortly after.
Which, if the whole point was for him to inspire, men to be great heroes, then dying a martyr's death against a dragon is a pretty good way to go.
And so, worked as inspiration for the Vikings.
So what was okay, and
yeah, I had a few other just minor notes. I liked Murphy just matter-of-factly asking Harry, "Can magic heal me?" because I find a lot of times, and this is something that our mutual friend John C. Wright talks about a lot, where you introduce something like time travel, and then the question is, well, why don't they just use that to solve all of their problems? Murphy knows that Harry was paralyzed, and now he isn't, and so it is a completely reasonable thing to at least ask.
Well, and the other thing, is that, and this is, kind of something Orson Scott Card has talked about in some of his, talk about writing science fiction, and this is something I think Brandon Sanderson would cover too, is that, like, if you want to write an interesting story and have, magic or, technology that approaches magic, you have to have limitations. You have to have, it can do this, it can't do this, and the more carefully you lay out all of that, the more fun it can be in telling the story, in playing with how those different parts, collide.
Well, and also if I read correctly, Harry's basically still paralyzed. Whenever he loses the power of the mantle, he pretty much just collapses, doesn't he?
Yep.
No, actually, no. Because in Skin Game, there were a couple of points where, like, he is, pierced by iron or something like that, and, like, it gives him, crippling pain because the power of winter is holding off the headache. But he is not, like, he's not paralyzed unless
when he explicitly renounced winter law, even though he did it by accident, he was instantly paralyzed again. The fairy, the enemy little one, who I think was implied to be a tooth fairy, when he was interrogating her, she pointed out that winter law means that as a guest, she has guest rights and he can't hurt her. And he said, F winter law. And immediately he collapsed. So I suspect in Skin Game, the mantle was still there. Its higher functions perhaps were suppressed, but some of the basic functions were still present. And my last point, I suspect that happened again in this book. Ethniu's big introduction was successfully kicking Mab through walls like she was nothing. But what I noticed was that she was specifically goading Mab into attacking her first. If Mab attacked her when Ethniu was still technically under guest right, as far as winter law was concerned, then a lot of that power would probably leave Mab, and it would be more like a sucker punch from a peer than being flattened by somebody who's completely superior. So I'm wondering if Ethniu, if this isn't a little bit of trickery on her part to make herself seem more powerful than she is in order to get everybody else on board.
That does make a certain amount of sense, because even though they go in there and, do a little massacre, they make a point that none of the people they killed were, technically protected under the Accords, and they even toss a weregild.
Exactly. They're still playing. They clearly think themselves above it, but they're still playing lip service to the Unseelie Accords. And maybe that's because they have to. They're not 100. They're not as powerful as they're presenting themselves.
Well, the protagonists also kind of figure that out when they point out that, if they really wanted to just do this, they could just wipe them out all at once without warning. But they're specifically trying to break up the nations.
Mm-hmm. So that might tie into how in the world it's even possible to defeat a Titan in the next book. And I don't know about you guys, I'm very much looking forward to reading that.
And now I get to gloat because I have an advanced copy of that.
Yeah, you get to read it tomorrow. Grumble, grumble, grumble.
But I do have to say, like, at this point, I have so much faith in Jim Butcher. Like, I have never felt like he cheated me or let me down with any of his stories. So I'm probably like more excited than I would be for just like pretty much any other series except maybe something by Brandon Sanderson.
Okay, here, wait a second. Let's see, because I'm looking at the scene where Ethnu punches Mab through the wall. Mab did not descend from her high seat so much as reality itself seemed to take a polite step to one side. One moment she was there, the next there was a trail of falling snow and frost-blanketed floor in a laser straight line, and Mab stood within arm's length of Korb. "Your maggot lips aren't worthy to speak his name," she hissed. "There you are," Korb said, his tone approving. "I knew you had to be inside all of that ice somewhere. Gather all the power you wish, old woman. You know who you are, and so do I. You are no one." Mab's face twisted in very human-looking fury, and that scared me more than anything I'd seen in a good long while. Her lips lifted into a snarl, and she began to speak, before her black eyes widened. Her focus shifted, her gaze swiftly tracking up the chain to the bronze and crystalline fist of the woman who held it. Korb let his head fall back and let out a delighted, crowing cackle. The cloaked figure moved every bit as quickly as Mab had. One moment she was 10 feet behind Korb, the next there was a sound like thunder. And then Ethnu kicks her through several stone walls. So I didn't see anything there that looked like breaking the rules yet. She may have intended. Of course, Harry
hadn't broken the rules either. It was the decision to break the rules that made him vulnerable. And that's what I think happened here. Mab didn't strike first, but she intended to strike before Ethnu attacked.
That's plausible. Okay.
Well, we'll have to see how the next book plays out. We know certain things about who has to survive the events of the next book, because there is a published short story that takes place after the events of the book.
Yes, I was thinking about that. I was talking about that with my wife the other day. I'm like, okay, so we know, from Christmas Eve, we know persons X, Y, and Z survive what's coming, and what else do we know or not know? So yeah, that's an interesting spot to be in as well. Okay. Well, we are coming on 2 hours now, and it is getting a little bit late. I do not know where you are, Harry, but it is getting a little bit late for us here. So I think
it's a tad late here. Yes, I'm one time zone ahead, so it's past 11.
Okay, so yeah, I think we'll go ahead and close this off. And if everything works out, I think in about 2 months I'll see you two again, and we will carry this conversation forward.
I look forward to it. I very much enjoyed this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking with both of you.
Yeah, it's been fun, and I am very impressed with how much y'all remember from this series.
That's what binge reading and taking notes are for.
Well,
and also Control F.
The other thing is that I have a fantastic memory for things that don't matter. If it's important, if it actually has practical significance, it is quite possible I will forget it. If it doesn't matter at all, I have a fantastic memory.
Yeah, I think with starting with Small Favor, pretty much everyone after that I read as they came out, and I have not reread most of them. So having y'all almost, from memory recite all these facts. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes a lot more sense now.
Okay. So good night, guys.
Good night.
Have a good one.